Jackie Albert-Simon will introduce the panel, and she will say a little bit more, but we would like to dedicate this evening to longtime member Roy Rowan, who passed away yesterday at the age of 96. He was a former OPC president, a World War II correspondent, and I can't describe everything he did. But you can go on the website and find out more about him. But he was one of the most wonderful people in the world. So this is Jacqueline Albert-Simon, a longtime OPC board member.
Okay, I'm continuing where Patty left off, but very quickly because our panelists have a lot to say. Just closer to your mouth. Yeah. Yeah, that's how I had it.
But just closer.
Okay, so the only point I want to make is the genesis of this panel. It occurred to me some time ago that one of the most, or perhaps the only unifying thing, universally, globally, historically, besides love and money, to quote Freud, is sport. So it was time we had a program about the third thing that is important to all of humanity. So when we started, I had no idea that sports would be such a big number on the front page of the New York Times and others. This has been in its late 40 years. And so we have amazing panelists who are going to speak to you and tell you things. I'm going to introduce one at a time as they speak. So Grant Wahl is first. Grant is a senior writer at Sports Illustrated. He has written for SI on soccer and other subjects, but primarily soccer. He has been at 10 World Cups and written about them, 6 men, 4 women. He also has covered Summer Olympics 6 times, correct? And in addition, he is an author with Crown and has the distinction of being the first book on soccer that ever made the New York Times bestseller list. So here is our first of the authors and panelists.
Thanks, Jackie. Really appreciate it. Thanks for having me here. I know several people on this panel, including Lindsay, Sean, just met Josh. I will say this, it's kind of cool, and I'm going to be the one to say it for Sean. He just won $50,000 on the $100,000 pyramid. That I watched the recording. This was this week. I watched the recording this morning and actually was fist pumping all over my apartment as you did this. So it was kind of cool. I cover soccer, as Jackie mentioned. One reason I cover the sport is because it's the global sport and it has the widest variety of stories, I think, of any sport that touch on all aspects of society and politics and culture, and basically every country in the world plays this sport. And there's also gender discussion to be had with soccer. And because this is a panel about the Olympics, I'm going to talk about stuff connected to Olympic soccer, and because the U.S. men never seem to qualify for the Olympics, and did not this year, I'm going to talk about U.S. women's soccer. And unfortunately for the U.S. women, who won the World Cup last year and have been generally regarded as the best women's soccer team in the world for decades, they went out in the quarterfinals of the Olympics this year. It's the earliest they've ever gone out in a major tournament. And yet there's still lots of really interesting discussion to be had.
And switch.
All right, does this work? It's got a red.
That's it, red?
Yeah, it's green.
Green is good.
So this is good. Ooh. Thank you. There are a lot of interesting topics connected to this U.S. women's soccer team right now. Three in particular that I'm going to bring up here in the next few minutes. One of which is an ongoing dispute between the U.S. women's soccer players and the U.S. Soccer Federation over equal pay for equal play, as the players would put it. And this has gotten a lot of attention ever since earlier this year. The U.S. women's players filed a complaint with the EEOC about wage discrimination compared to the U.S. men's soccer players, who make quite a bit more money, or at least have over the years, and whose prize money for the World Cup, the U.S. men got $9 million for going out in the round of 16 in their last World Cup, which was quite a bit more than the U.S. women got for winning the Women's World Cup last year. I think it was around $2 million. Even though the television broadcast, I also do stuff for Fox Sports, we had that game, had 27 million people watch it in the United States, which was the most ever for any soccer game in the United States, male or female, over the years. And so there's a collective bargaining agreement that the U.S. women's players have with the U.S. Soccer Federation that pays the players a certain amount depending on how well they do in World Cups, and pays them per game for every time they play with the national team. The U.S. men's players have a similar collective bargaining agreement with U.S. Soccer that pays them different amounts. So there's so much happening in the wider context right now because equal pay for genders is a huge part, or a big part of this election cycle that we're seeing. And we've seen Hillary Clinton put out Twitter posts supporting the U.S. women's soccer players in this ongoing dispute. And so it's something to keep following here. And I, as someone who follows this very closely and speak to both sides, my sense at this point is the talks between the U.S. players, women's players, and U.S. soccer start again in October, and it could get pretty contentious. The players could go on strike as soon as January 1st. Their collective bargaining agreement, the current one, runs out. And I don't think we'll have an answer from the EEOC about their wage discrimination complaint by then. But I do think from a PR perspective, this was pretty brilliant on their lawyer to go public with this and have that potentially help, I think, their CBA talks. So this is something that's going on in the background here. And in talking with the U.S. women's players, they feel like this is something that they need to take a stand on. Do I think they more pay in the next collective bargaining deal? I think they will, significantly more. Do I think they'll get equal pay to the U.S. men? I'm not so sure about that. And I think even the players on the women's side maybe aren't so sure about that. They're just trying to get the best deal possible. But this is going to be an ongoing thing that we see. Because among all the women's sports athletes in America, I would argue that this team of the U.S. women's soccer players is probably as well known, as powerful as any of them, or more so. And I think it's going to set a standard for how women's soccer players in other countries fight for their own recognition and investment by their own federations, which is pretty shamefully low in several other countries, but also other women's sports in the United States too. Now, the most influential player on this U.S. women's soccer team behind the scenes and pushing for fighting, taking on U.S. soccer is the goalkeeper, Hope Solo, who is, I think just about everyone who follows the sport would agree, the best goalkeeper in the world over the last decade, probably. She's been playing in World Cup since 2007. She's a game changer in a lot of ways. Even though she's 35 now, I think. But during this Olympics, she got more controversial attention again, and I've covered her for a long time. After the U.S. went out unexpectedly in the quarterfinals against Sweden, I asked her what she thought about the game in the post-game session, and she's always had pointed thoughts, but she was actually really upset with the way Sweden played, a very sort of conservative style, not really trying to, they packed things in, realizing the U.S. was a better team, and just tried to score on the counterattack on a quick strike. And Solo went off on that and said this was cowardly. That was the word that got people all riled up. She said cowardly twice. It was generally viewed as a poor sport. This, because it's the Olympics, because she's representing her country, because there's a lot of media attention on every little thing that happens in the Olympics, as Ryan Lochte can tell you, became a huge deal. And I don't think she quite realized how big a deal it would become. And a couple weeks ago, after everyone was back home, U.S. Soccer announced that it was terminating Solo's contract with U.S. Soccer, that they were punishing her not just for what she said in this post-game statement calling the Swedes cowards, but what U.S. Soccer called a long list of transgressions, kind of a lifetime achievement award, as they would put it, from over the years. Now, some of those past incidents include last year she was suspended for a month after her husband got a DUI driving a U.S. team van that she happened to be in. This happened in LA. She was also involved in a fourth-degree misdemeanor, as she would want everyone to hear, but domestic violence case in Seattle in a family dispute involving her half-sister and nephew. Now, facts have always been in dispute on that. That's why U.S. Soccer did not suspend her for that, but U.S. Soccer never suspended her for that, and a lot of people publicly thought they should. Now, this was right before the World Cup last year. So what's inescapable, I think, is U.S. Soccer, the federation, has not given Solo any punishment or a harsh punishment for things that happened right before the World Cup when they needed her most last year, when she was a game changer. And now they've given her a 6-month suspension and terminated her contract, a much more severe penalty for ostensibly calling the Swedes cowards, which she would say is, probably not the word I should have used, but that's what I said. This is kind of like a post-game speech. So there's that's going on. She's filing a grievance. She thinks that U.S. Soccer is punishing her because of her influence in organizing the players to try and get equal pay. So there's a lot going on there too, that we'll have to wait and see what happens. My take happens to be, though, that there are no big women's soccer events for 3 years now until the next World Cup in 2019. That's why U.S. Soccer can get away with suspending her for 6 months. But if she actually wanted to play again for U.S. Soccer, it's not that big a deal, in my opinion. She would miss 4 games, maybe 6, that aren't that important. They're just exhibitions, friendlies. And she gets 3 months severance on her terminated contract. And every U.S. women's player's contract ends on December 31st anyway, when their collective bargaining agreement ends. And yet, her response was clearly one of anger, that they terminated her contract, fired her. And so she has said, I'm not playing for my club team in Seattle for the rest of the year. She doesn't think she's going to go back to the national team. And so I think her response probably could have been more measured. I think U.S. Soccer, I don't totally know why they terminated her contract in addition to suspending her for 6 months, unless they wanted to just set her off. Now, while all of this is happening, another story that you may have followed, that people outside of soccer followed last year, a big one, was all these arrests at FIFA. And the U.S. FBI and Department of State, having undertaken a very big, costly investigation, raided the hotel where a lot of FIFA bigwigs were staying before the FIFA Congress back in late May of last year. And finally, this organization FIFA, which oversees global soccer, which has been thought of as corrupt and shady for so many years, is finally fearful of a governing, of a body, an entity, and that's the United States. And what's happened is they've arrested a lot of top international soccer officials from different nationalities. The US FBI has justified that it's within their jurisdiction because a lot of this money has gone through US banks. And it's totally overturned everything at FIFA. Sepp Blatter, the longtime president, was forced out finally. Now, what all this means for women's soccer and women in soccer, stick with me here, is that the new FIFA and the new officials that are replacing the old ones are talking a really good game right now about making women's soccer bigger around the world, especially in countries where it's always been treated poorly or it doesn't even exist. There's just no support, no investment. And we're also seeing now, finally, women getting into positions of power at FIFA, which oversees the sport globally. And to give you an idea of how bad it is, FIFA has been around for over 100 years, and they did not get their first woman on their board in completely male-dominated, male-only culture for so long. When I've dealt with these guys, it's like a Mad Men episode come to life, basically, in the 21st century. And finally, they're starting to, they have new statutes this year where each continent is now required to have at least one woman on the continental board that then represents that continent on the FIFA board. And it's not enough, but it's getting closer finally. And then FIFA is starting a women's soccer department that they're going to name an executive director for very soon here. So they're talking a very good game. They have a new president, a guy named Gianni Infantino, Italian-Swiss guy, who says women's development, women's soccer, women in soccer, is going to be the biggest thing happening in FIFA over the next so many years. But it's still talk, so that's something to keep an eye on moving forward here. And for me, this is, Jackie talked about how important sports is, but the idea of getting women involved in the global sport in countries where in a lot of them it's not happening or hasn't happened, to me is a really important story to follow in the years that come ahead.
That's a great report. That's a great report, Grant, and thanks so much. I learned a lot. I'm not a soccer mom, but I sure picked up a lot of information. Thank you so much. And our next, I have two things to say. I was so excited with Grant's book on the bestseller list, I forgot to mention the name. And it is contrary to all this talk about women's soccer. The book was called the Beckham Experiment. So there's two sides to every story. Okay, our next speaker is Sean Gregory. Sean has been writing for Time Magazine and Times.com for the last 14 years. He has done a number of cover stories and a number of features, major features on football injuries, on the Olympics, on the economics of college football, and done feature stories on major players in the world, including such people as Serena Williams, lately in the news as of today, yet again, our hero, LeBron and LeBron James, and you're seeing both others of us, but those are the ones I'm mentioning. He too has covered the Summer Olympics since the first games in Athens in 2004. Did I leave anything out?
2004, yeah.
Okay. And Sean was recently in Rio, of course, covering the Olympics for 3 weeks. So he's got stuff to tell us too.
Thank you, Jackie. Thank you so much. I just was thinking about what to talk about and how to come, shed some light on the Olympics and scandal and corruption. And I just kind of want to have a jumping off point. Why are the Olympics so complicated? The Olympics are a very complicated endeavor. And I think it'd be hopefully interesting to talk about why and how, and brings my own experience from Rio to that question. So bear with me as I kind of go through some, not totally stream of conscience, but some kind of thoughts along the way. So when I was in December, I went down to Rio to kind of do a scouting mission. I knew I would be covering the games in August, and it was kind of get a lay of the land type of thing. Now, the interesting thing about Rio and what all cities, the Olympic bidding process is the host city is named 7 years before the actual Olympics start. And that, poses potential complications that we really saw with Brazil. In 2009, Brazil was on the upswing. It seemed to, the country was flush with oil, seemed to avoid some of the pain that spread during the Great Recession here and elsewhere. And it was the first South American country ever to be awarded Olympic Games. And it was a huge amount of symbolism and pride. And then, of course, over the next 7 years, I should say, of course, but what happened is that Brazil has had terrible economic issues, political issues, impeachment trials, and social unrest. And so now the stage for the Rio Olympics was a city that is ravaged with extreme poverty, a place where it's one of the most beautiful places in the world, but where there's up on hills, just thinking about it in the sense of it, there's just these called favelas. They're the folks in the favelas and the advocates for favelas don't like the word slums, and for understandable reason, but it's what you would think as just the worst kind of, no running water, bad infrastructure. Cops have come in and tried to control drug gangs, and that's led to violence. So places that need public resources, now public resources are being diverted to the Olympics. And what I saw in December was I visited the Bio Autodromo, which was a favela right next to the Olympic Park. And when I went there in December, they had already displaced the residents and moved them to places, and a lot of places they didn't want to move to. 4,200 families in Rio were displaced because of Olympic-related construction and infrastructure. And so, we did a story, and just seeing it live, the place looked like, war-torn rubble, but people still wanted to stay. And in December, there was, why would you want to live in these places? And the government saying they're going to provide you housing, but there was such pride in their homes and the sincerity of it, and you can see protest language in Portuguese, Olympics exclusion, Olympics aren't for everyone, that type of thing. And the pain and the injustice that they felt was real. And so it was a little, searing coming back in August and picturing where was this favela again? And at the end of the day, there was slivers of it that I don't believe anybody was living there. But it was gone. It was basically, as I think, the kind of parking lot where the media transportation was. So that's kind of gets to the complication. Like, as somebody who loves being at the Olympics and reporting about the Olympics, there's all this kind of back stuff going on. Is it hypocritical to publicize the Olympics or to be a fan? And sports, sports gets to that all over, whether you're rooting for football, where people are putting brain injury, and college sports. So we think the players should probably be paid. We're going to watch the Final Four anyway. So what makes you believe in the value of the Olympics? So you just, being on the ground, just some of the sites, and these are storylines we all kind of saw, was, when you watch Usain Bolt run, it's a very moving experience, both on TV, as millions of people saw, and being in a stadium with Usain Bolt, it's basically like a Mandela-like figure with the worship of fans of a global athletic figure. It's fascinating. I mean, it was Bolt, 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 and as if he was Ali. And this is just a guy who runs fast and is very charismatic. And you see what athletes mean to people around the world. These weren't just folks from Jamaica. These were folks from all over the world, particularly in Brazil. They really adopted him as one of their own. And Grant can speak to this. We were both lucky, in my mind, I don't know, sure, flip it went out. Would say lucky to be in the Maracana Stadium when Brazil won its first ever soccer gold medal. And the beauty of that experience was, it meant so much to the country because they played Germany in the final, and Germany in the 2014 World Cup beat Brazil 7-1 in the semifinal. Humiliating, absolutely humiliating. So it was perfect that this small sliver of revenge, because I spoke to a lot of fans and a lot of them said, well, this doesn't really totally make up for the World Cup if we beat Germany today, but hey, we'll take it. And then the most brilliant player in Brazil, the face of the games for the country, Neymar, global soccer superstar, plays for Barcelona, and made a decision to play for his home country when he really didn't have to. Most players, the Olympic soccer tournament's a little different. It's 23 and under, except you get 3 exceptions, and most global stars skipped it, but Neymar was there, and because he felt, and he wasn't in, and he got hurt for the semifinals. So I'm sure Brazilians think it might have been a little different if he was there in the World Cup semi. So, and then he scores one of the most, I'll say it, I've ever seen, and you've seen a lot more goals than me, but just a beautiful goal in the first half. Germany ties it, and then there's a penalty shootout, and the goaltender for the goalie for Brazil makes a brilliant save on the last shot, right? The 5th shot, last round. And then who gets to make the winning penalty shot for Brazil? Freaking Neymar. And he gets to the ball, he does a little stutter step, and it goes in, and there was just this amazing explosion. And what stands out for me, I'll never forget, so I just count myself lucky to be part of this and see part of this, and maybe hopefully convey some of this, was the subway ride home from that event. First of all, Brazil has beautiful subways, and it's amazing how, again, just a city making prioritizing different things. It was a beautiful subway, and the whole, just being a stranger there, and people kind of knew I wasn't Brazilian. I was kind of the only non-Brazilian on the subway, but you felt so safe and so happy. And it was, the subway was literally shaking because the Brazilians were chanting and singing about Maradona. They basically, when the Brazilians win something, they decide to rip apart their rival Argentina. It's just how they kind of celebrate it. So I didn't really know what they were saying, but I kept saying Maradona, Maradona. I kept hearing it. You just know they weren't saying nice things about Maradona. And then, so that's why we love the Olympics. Now, a few points about and I'll run through a little quickly about, what the cost of the Olympics. And there's no secret that cities that win the Olympics, it tends to hurt them economically more than help them. Just a few quick examples. You know, the average cost overrun, this study was done before Brazil. 200% is the average cost overrun. You know, for the Olympics. During the Beijing Olympics, everybody says it's an economic jolt. Hotel stays dropped actually 39% compared to the prior year. What people don't realize the economics of big sporting events is that you're substituting crowds. I mean, there's lots of crowds, but there's also a substitution effect. And the spillover effect, it's hard to replicate the Olympic experience in Rio repeatedly. It's a two-week thing. And then it's not like, oh, I went to Rio for the Olympics and you can't say you should do that too. I mean, Rio might be not the greatest example because there's plenty of reasons to go to Rio. And there's big parties there and stuff, but that's an interesting kind of, and Rio had cost overruns of 51%. I've seen different estimates, but $11 billion I've seen in one estimate of public money going towards Olympic-related projects in a city that was under a financial state of emergency. And some of the projects that were done for the Olympics was, for example, a subway line that went from basically the tourist area of Rio to a place near the Olympic Park in an upscale neighborhood of Rio. And you can help but wonder what good is that going to do long term. Cost billions of dollars, basically to get tourists from Olympic tourists out to the Olympic Park, bypassing all kinds of the favelas where they can use some running water. But you just see it in the kind of dichotomy there. And machine guns that were there to keep people safe, drains on resources, just kind of make you wonder about the future of this. And look, I just want to touch real quick on the doping wars that have unfolded. And that's more the spectator point of view. Who do you trust, and what's going on? Now we have this global battle with Russia. Russia just, came out yesterday, the New York Times reported that Serena Williams and Simone Biles' medical records were hacked. And they took banned substances with permission, so they didn't really do it. It doesn't seem like they did anything wrong. And, Lily King, the US swimmer, kind of saying Russia shouldn't be here. Russia had state-sponsored doping and still most of their team was able to compete. Interesting, a lot of people were mad about that. I went to the Village at one point, trying to get the athlete reaction, and a lot of them said, unless they're proven dirty, they should compete. And so fans tend to get more upset about them than politicians maybe than the competition even. And so who do you trust? Geopolitical conflict, and just really, I'll end on just a look for the future. Where's the Olympic movement going? Now, cities are getting wise to the cost of the Olympics. We've had recent winter games, cities back out. Boston backed out after, public opinion turned. Winter Olympics are a little tougher sell. Sochi, spent $14 billion, was the most expensive, at least Winter Olympics ever. And final two were Beijing and what's the city in Kazakhstan again? Almaty. So that was the final two. The 2022 Winter Olympics went to Beijing. So the 2024 Olympics, Los Angeles, which is one of the rare profitable Olympic games, they're bidding. It'll be interesting to see if they get, so the 2024 bidding, it's Rome, Paris, Los Angeles. So we're not seeing the summer games yet, world-class cities saying we don't want this, but we've seen it in the winter. Are we going to start seeing it for the summer? And where is this thing going in the next few decades as the costs of the Olympics are more transparent and apparent? Thank you.
Okay, again, many thanks for all that I learned, Sean. And it is the big point. The Olympics have gone through so much restructuring that the question is, where are they going from here? And I think we're all thinking about that more than one would have expected. It's part of tradition and history, but we are moving in directions that are more complex and not as simple as my view. Sports are universal, and it's all your views. So the worst is yet to come. and Josh is going to tell us a little bit about that. Josh Fine is a producer for Real Sports, the Bryant Gumbel sports show on television. Josh, among other things, has won in 2014 an OPC award, the David Andelman and Patricia Title Award for Best Reporting, Television Reporting on Universal issues concerned with human rights. And it was his story about the problematic, complex, and unattractive and abusive policies that Qatar used to advance its status in sports and to advance its sport titles. That was a very unusual program. And then he went on, I don't know if it was earlier or later, to do the program on Putin and Russia, and Putin's outsized use of the Russian treasury to advance his enthusiasm for sports on the universal screen. I've got to say that in addition to winning that award, the Putin story earned 2 nominations for 2 Emmys, and also helped the whole HBO Sports to win a Peabody. And he's going to talk to us now about the International Olympics Committee, which adds to the complications about who wins the title to the next place for Olympics to take place, winter, summer, or what have you. Josh, did I leave anything out that's important?
Good Lord, I hope not.
There is a lot more. There is a lot more, but I think we want to listen to them, not me.
Mostly I showed up here today because Lindsay, our next talker, wrote this book about the Les Bleus, about the France and soccer, which after the bombings of the National Stadium, was it a year ago or so? I furiously read that book in like one night. I'm like, I need to know everything I can about the relationship between France. So thank you for that. No, it was very helpful. So we, in July, did, at HBO, we have this show called Real Sports with Bryant Gumbel. It's an hour-long show every month. And usually we have 3 or 4 pieces each month. It's sort of like 60 minutes, but about sports. But we decided this year in July to do an hour-long special, which turned out to be an hour-and-a-half long special on the International Olympic Committee. And the idea was the IOC is, by their telling, the world's one of the world's most important peace movements. They're certainly one of the world's most powerful sports organizations. And so we wanted to kind of take a look at the score on what they've done and not done to fulfill their stated mission. And we found a number of troubling trends. I took the 90-minute program and edited it down to 10 minutes. So instead of me yapping away, Chad is going to roll that. Just a kind of a quick setup on it. We examined the makeup of the IOC, the types of things they ask of the host countries, and then sort of examines their seeming preference for working with the authoritarian regimes who seem perhaps all too happy to get the international legitimacy that comes with hosting the games, and they don't give the IOC a particularly hard time about any of their demands. The first woman you'll hear from is a former Olympic swimmer who started investigating the makeup of the IOC and wasn't too happy with what she found out.
I think it said it all. Do you have anything to add? Do you have anything to add? I don't know. For me,
I'm okay.
it told the story. More? No. Okay, so our next speaker, who is also co-moderator with me, is Lindsay Sarah Krasnoff. I think of her as LK. And we should use that name more as she grows in stature and professionalism. Lindsay is a historian. She has a PhD in history and has used it particularly to great advantage in her book on the French soccer team, Les Bleus, the history of soccer from post-World War up until 2010, correct? This book historically tells the story of the view of the French government on sports. There's a question of race, there's a question of identity, there's a question of culture, and the question of French concentration on making sure that France is one of the countries in the big game. In addition, Lindsay worked for 7 years at the State Department, but never let that interfere with her passion for extracurricular writing on sports, for CNN, for the New Yorker, for the Rounder, what else? Plenty. There's so much to say about Lindsay that I'm going to save it for later. And in the meantime, I think Lindsay wants to continue this conversation, and then our four panelists are going to get together with Lindsay leading the questions and the Q&A. All yours. Thank you.
Can I take the mic? Terrific. Great. Thank you very much. Some of you have already touched on some of the things I was going to bring up in a good way. We can add to the conversation. I was going to kind of provide a little bit of the larger term, so what context that kind of comes with my realm in history, and taking a step back and start with the whole doping scandals that have, whether you decide to call them reemerge or have resurfaced, they've always been there perhaps. Certainly this week's disclosures about the medical records of certain American athletes, but also really kind of delving into the issue of the Russian state sponsored doping programs that were brought to light earlier this year through accounts given to the New York Times and WADA, the World Anti-Doping Agency's McLaren report, confirming that. And doping has always been a part of the modern sports world and of the modern Olympics. The modern Olympics were really created in their essence in 1896. The first documented case of doping at the Olympics was in 1904 with an American runner who was given some combination of egg white, strychnine, and brandy by his doctor in order to get him hopped up enough to finish the race. So whether we like it or not, doping has always been a part of the modern games, whether it's the Olympics, professional sport, World Cup, other major international tournaments. And I think one of the questions that arises is why? Certainly there's this reason of trying to excel and perform to be number one. But also when you have certain actors, whether they be state actors or other entities that go along with such programs or turn a blind eye to such programs, we always get into this question of the pride of winning. And I think that's one of the themes that kind of comes out when we talk about scandal in the Olympics or scandal in the modern sports world, whether they be larger tournaments or even within the professional leagues. Why does one want to win, particularly in national competitions such as the Olympics? Supposedly we're in a post-national world, or at least that's what many of the pundits tell us. I would suggest maybe we're not quite there yet. And one of the questions that I hope we'll get into a little bit is, are we in a new Cold War of sports, or did the original Cold War of sports that typified competitions from the Soviet Union's entry in 1952 through the early 1990s, did that ever in fact really stop? What does a country get out of winning or putting its best foot forward? Well, certainly there's a lot in terms of legitimacy. To host a major international tournament, such as the Olympics or the World Cup, Basketball World Championship, or other events, it confers to many that you've arrived, that you have the infrastructure, that you have the money, that you have the support, the popularity to pull off such an event. It's also in many ways a form of nation branding, to put your best face forward to the nation. We certainly think about this a lot today, and how Rio really tried to pull out all the stops to give the world a show, despite the quite severe political, economic context in which they occurred. But certainly this has been going on for quite a while, going back to decades. The Berlin Games, the Nazi Olympics, as they're often referred to, the same exact thing, using a major tournament as kind of a cosmetic facelift to put your best face forward to the world. So it confers legitimacy, it confers certain elements of perhaps glory, that you are able to produce and sustain and train such athletes, that they represent the nation and the ideals that national identities or senses of exceptionalism try to convey. That's certainly a part of it. And what we saw emerging starting in the 1950s onwards was a space for nations that were not the superpowers of the world to use the sports terrain as ways to flex their muscle, almost literally, in ways that they might not be able to in other aspects of the international world. And one thinks often of the Cold War, the battles between Washington and Moscow over policy, over the hearts and minds of publics in the world, particularly in the decolonizing global South. One thinks of the Cold War of athletics and the medal fights between the Soviet Union and the United States. There was also Cold War battles within the Eastern Bloc, and of how East Germany used the Olympics or other sports venues to try to assert independence and perhaps at times a degree of so-theirs to the Soviet Union. So there is that context of it as well. But certainly other countries use this sports terrain to assert themselves, to say, well, we might not be number one or number two. We might not have the same ability to influence global military policy, international development in quite the same way. But we do have the ability to try to influence others around the world through producing athletes who win. Maybe not always gold medals, but certainly on the medal table. And so when I've done a lot of my work on the history of sport, and particularly in the French case, it was exactly this, this little niche that many countries that were not the Soviet Union, that were not the United States, that were not East Germany, really sought to fill. Sports was an arena in which they could win, could gain some degrees of influence, and perhaps try to influence how other countries adapted their sports programs or looked to them for cultural cues and innovations. So there is certainly this idea of sport as a venue for many different ideas and topics. One of the interesting things that has come out of my work on French sport as Josh mentioned, is this idea that it's not just one thing to win, but it's another thing to choose your battles. The French government archives for the Ministry of Youth and Sports very clearly detailed that they recognized they could never really come in number 1, 2, or 3 in the Olympic medal tables. They just didn't have the population, the financial resources, or the wherewithal to do so. But what they did was look at what sports they thought they could excel at, where they thought they did produce winning athletes already. The sports that they felt were best suited to their national psyche. And there are reports within the archives that say the most cerebral sports are those that are best suited to the French psyche, because we are one of the more cerebral cultures around. The most cerebral sport is fencing for individual sports, and basketball for team sports. Therefore, we should put a lot of resources and funding into ensuring that our fencers and our basketball players will win, because through them we can show valor on the world stage. I'm paraphrasing, but this is the essence that you get away from, that you take away from some of these documents. They picked and chose exactly where they decided to invest. As time goes forward, one of the questions that I ask myself, and that I'd like to ask the panel as well, is to what extent are the Olympics still the #1 most prized sports competition? Or has the FIFA World Cup, the Men's Cup, perhaps started to overtake the Olympics in terms of, well, many different categories under the sun? Unfortunately, I think we're still quite a ways away from the Women's World Cup really reaching that rung, but it certainly has made significant strides in the past few editions, just even looking at the percentage increase of media numbers. The other thing that I wanted to just kind of toss out there in terms of thinking points, and trying to edit myself out so we have time to get into an interesting discussion, is the so what factor that I think everyone has touched upon a little bit in their different ways. Given the corruption, given the scandal, given the difficulties, the expenses, so what? Why do such competitions still matter? Do they need to go forward in the future? What are the benefits? Do they outweigh the negatives? And so I will edit myself out there. Perhaps that's a good question to start passing it back over. Anyone care to? Grant, take it away.
Okay. I've always kind of said half seriously, but I can certainly get 100% serious about it over the years, that every World Cup should be in Germany or France or some country that is easy to travel around in and has great infrastructure, and the stadiums are already built, and you don't need to spend all this money building white elephants, using public money that could be going toward schools and hospitals and things that Brazil could use, to take one example. And that could apply to the Olympics too. Why not have them in Athens every 4 years, or some other place? And I guess I wonder if that's a potential endpoint when you see fewer countries, fewer cities bidding to host the Winter Olympics. If that might happen with the Summer Olympics. With soccer, it seems like a lot of places still want to host the World Cup, even though the next 2 men's World Cups are in Russia and Qatar, which not too many fans in the US at least are excited about going to.
Right. Why do you think that there is still that fervent desire to host the World Cup, where it seems to be wearing off with the Olympics? They're both multi-week major sporting events.
I do think with the Winter Olympics, at least, there's fewer countries that are really intense about those sports. Soccer is still a huge deal in a ton of countries, and emerging countries, like the idea of Qatar hosting the World Cup, still just on the face of it, that's insane. It's absolutely crazy. And so the country has no history really with the sport. The temperatures are far too high to have held it when they first proposed in the summer, when it's 120 degrees. And so now they had to move it to November, December, where it will be livable, but it will also completely upset the calendar that global soccer runs on. And yet there's countries that are going to bid, I was just talking to people today about bidding for the World Cup in 2026. And the US, which bid for 2022 and didn't get it, lost to Qatar, is going to almost, assuredly bid for World Cup 26. So there's going to be always countries that want this, I think. But Winter Olympics, maybe fewer. Summer Olympics, not so sure.
At the risk of stating the obvious, it's so much easier to do a World Cup than the Olympics. There's a gazillion sports, soccer. But I think so. There's an unlimited number of countries who will bid for the World Cup more or less forever. And the problem I think is that these entities, FIFA and the IOC, are by their nature monopolies. They have complete control. So they're able to set the price, if you will. And if you're not interested in that price, then you just don't bid. And increasingly, the countries that are interested in bidding for these things are either sort of autocratic regimes, Russia, China, Qatar, or to some degree, Kazakhstan. For a while, it was countries that were looking to sort of make a mark on the world stage, whether it was Brazil or Spain after the end of Franco. But increasingly, it's really these sort of one-party governments, and this benefits these countries in a couple ways. One is the obvious one in terms of the prestige they get around the world, but the other is internally, and there hasn't been a lot of scholarship on this. Maybe this could be your next book, Lindsay. If you have total control of the treasury, like Putin or like the Chinese Communist Party, you can tell the IOC or tell FIFA, we're going to spend $50 billion, and these organizations, IOC or FIFA, are happy to oblige because they outbid, by a factor of 3 all the Western democratic countries, and then it benefits you internally. You have control of the airwaves. There's no free press in Russia or China, and so you have this sort of 2-week, or in the case of the World Cup, month-long sort of fetting of the leadership, and there's no way to get that any other way. And so, I think there's been an absence that hasn't been looked at enough, and
the archives aren't open for that. Well, kind of carrying on that, you're starting to see some alternative models emerge within, I think the next, and correct me if I'm wrong, the next men's European football championship. The Euro is going to be co-hosted between, I think, several countries. Same for the European basketball championship. So they're starting to come up with co-hosting solutions, somewhat like with the World Cup back in 2002. Is that a potential model going forward that might help to crack down a little bit on some of the corruption we see with bids? Or does it just continue the same sort of habits and behavior?
I'll just briefly say I'm highly skeptical of that. I mean, these organizations like the IOC are under pressure to try and make this less expensive for the hosts and the like, but there's not any incentive for them to dramatically change it. They get some bad PR out of it, but that's about it. And so, yes, they now say that countries can do joint bids and the like, but I think that's tweaking on the edges. I don't personally see that changing things that much.
Yeah, same here. Just an observation off your initial point about how much does it matter, and should Germany be a permanent host? And I mean, home field. I'm sure one resistance to that idea is home field advantage.
Might win every World
Right. So yeah, it's an interesting thought and theory, but think you'd see resistance to that, and as a demonstration of how much this does matter to people, how much winning matters.
Given that winning does matter and hosting does matter, for both Sean and Grant, since you were at Rio, what are your assessments of, was Brazil correct to go ahead and host these games and then the Paralympic Games, which I think are still ongoing right now, given the expense and everything that you've described around them? Did they win at hosting these?
I think they won the press conference in a way, because they won the publicity. Zika was a huge scare. Didn't seem to affect too many people. The water pollution was a big scare. I didn't see a ton, if any, stories about sailors and rowers. There were incidents of crime, but even Rio kind of won that press battle, publicity battle, with the Lochte thing in a way, where, Lochte exaggerated what happened to him, and Rio, I should say used, but saw that maybe as an opportunity to say you can't just always blame it on crime. So I think the games, if you look back over the years, and the athletes, people tend to forget about favelas and other things when the athletes were there. So, they had no choice whether they should have hosted or not once they got the games. I should say they had no choice, but it'd be very hard to kind of back out. And but the big question is what goes, what happens going forward with both the facilities and the Brazilian economy, and more specifically to Rio, the Rio economy is 4 years from now. What's the place going to look like? And if it looks better, I don't get the sense that having the Olympics will be a huge long-term economic solution, because it really hasn't been for any city. Los Angeles made money, but Los Angeles was still Los Angeles.
So I spent a lot of time in Brazil the last few years, because I was there for 6 weeks for the World Cup in 2014, all over the country, and then for the Olympics in Rio. But the soccer part of the Rio Olympics, they actually farm out to other cities around the country. So I was in Manaus, Belo Horizonte, Brasilia, and then a bunch of other ones in 2014. And I went back, and when I was in Manaus, which is in the Amazon, and they built this amazing soccer stadium in the middle of the Amazon, and it is a total white elephant. There are no club professional teams that use the stadium. The maintenance costs are in the hundreds of thousands of dollars per month to maintain a facility that they barely use. They don't even host concerts there because it costs too much to use the facility they built. And it's, to me, this is folly. It's just such a waste. Manaus is a really interesting place to go to. I've been there twice now, but I can't believe they built this soccer stadium there for a very small number of games for over a very small period of time. And it's not just Manaus. I was in Brasilia, which is the capital of the country, but they spent $1 billion on this stadium in Brasilia that does not have a professional club soccer team that uses it regularly. And it's like we don't learn the lessons. I just had a long conversation yesterday with a Russia expert about World Cup 2018 in Russia, and they're having all these problems building the stadium in St. Petersburg, which he said is already the most expensive sports stadium ever built in the world. And it's not done yet, and it's already been like $1.5 billion have been spent on this, and it's a mess of corruption, and they're trying to get it ready for this prep tournament, the Confederations Cup in June of 2017, and it may not be ready for $1.5 billion. One thing I will say, though, and this is more about US and global media thing, is in my experience before every Olympics, before every World Cup, especially if it's taking place in an emerging country, the media latches on to something, some scare that could screw everything up. So For Brazil, it was Zika and safety, to some extent preparation of facilities. With the World Cup in South Africa in 2010, it was safety, facilities. With the China Olympics in 2008, it was pollution. With the London Olympics in 2012, it was terrorism concerns. And you hear all this drumbeat in the months leading up to this big event. And then invariably what happens is not much. All of these things we've been hearing about aren't really big concerns. And when I left for Brazil on, at the end of July, and I posted that on my Facebook, so many people were like, "Stay safe. Did you take your bug repellent? Ha ha ha!" And they really thought I was in danger of not coming back in one piece. So, and I think that's mainly the media causing that.
Well, but with Zika, there were and are concerns, right? I mean, there was, I think the U.S. military wasn't allowing its personnel to go down there. I believe corporations weren't allowing there. So it's not like, sure, it would be overkill to say everyone was going to drop dead of Zika. That would be...
The media totally failed on the Zika topic ahead of Brazil Olympics. And my wife's an infectious disease doctor who has worked in Brazil and a lot of other countries and writes in the media. Her biggest single thing was the Harvard Public Health Review had a guy write a piece saying, absolutely 100%, this was in mid-July, they have to move or cancel the Olympics in Rio because of Zika. And at the time, her response was, and she wrote this, no. Whether they should have chosen Rio in the first place to host the Olympics is a different topic. You can certainly argue that they shouldn't. But the Zika situation, this is going to be winter. And when people in Brazil, at least, and mosquitoes are not going to be a significant problem. And if you take the proper precautions, which include, wear bug repellent, wear long pants and long sleeves. But there's this hysteria that happened with Zika and has typically happened with so many other events, World Cups and Olympics.
And the hysteria is not useful, obviously. But if I remember correctly, didn't even the U.S. Olympic Committee advise pregnant women not to go, or people who were planning on becoming pregnant?
Yeah, and my wife wrote this too. So pregnant women, if you are pregnant, yeah, you should go.
The CDC was saying that. So that put athletes in a really tough spot, right? I mean, and if you've trained your entire life for this moment and you have, you're in a difficult spot. That's not that seemed at least arguably unfair to the athletes to put them in that kind of position. Sure, it was massively overhyped, but
yeah, I would say the CDC actually was really impressive in how they handled all of this. They themselves said they should not move or cancel these Olympics. World Health Organization, not as good a track record over the last couple of years with Zika and Ebola and all that stuff, but CDC is pretty good.
So one last general question for panel discussion, and then we'll open it up for others. To get back to Sean's original question, why are the Olympics so complicated? Looking at it from the long-term stance, they kind of always have been, or at least pretty much for most of the 20th century, when they were still being incubated in the first part of the century. They really weren't that complicated, mostly because you didn't have as many different nations involved. The mediatization of the games certainly weren't there. The same degrees of nationalism were still not there. But it's after the World War I period when you see countries like Germany unable to participate in the initial Olympiads after the war. And then certainly the fascist games and so forth, that things do become much more complicated because they do become politicized. They do start to draw in elements in addition to pure sport and pure sport competition. So why are they so complicated today?
I mean, it's It's an event that brings almost 200 countries and agendas and geopolitical rivalries and together. And countries, as you said earlier, it's a global world. The nationalism, is so heightened these days, and we're seeing it domestically. And that's why, you're seeing it with the national anthem protests, and you're seeing it in political discourse, and you're seeing it when Michael Phelps was winning. It was not that social media is a reflection of the broad populace, but I'm just struck by just the fervor of America, 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 and they're expensive, and they cost countries millions of dollars, and as we saw, lives, and that complication's never gonna go away, and it's a reflection of the world. I mean, that's kind of cliche, but Russia, where the United States is a geopolitical rival of Russia, now the Russians have a state-sponsored doping program, and they're hacking. Looks like they're hacking our political process, and now they're hacking our athletic process. So, but that's what makes them, also important. I think the complications make them very, very important.
The question is, why are they so complicated, or why are they so big, or
Why are they so complicated?
running the Olympics? I mean, it's I think a legitimately complicated enterprise to run. 20 sports, and with was it 10,000 athletes or something like that? I mean, that's not an insignificant undertaking.
Right. No, certainly. But in the larger sense, why do they evoke such emotion, such whether it's media scares going into them, knee-jerk reactions, nationalism? Why are they just so complicated today?
Oh Lord. Well, I don't know if they are more complicated now than they were before in terms of sense of nationalism. It'd be sort of an interesting study if, like, pre-Cold War interest in the Olympics is higher than post-Cold War interest. I don't know. I mean, nationalism. I mean, look at all the nationalistic parties in Europe that are gaining power in Austria and France, and the Brexit matter. I mean, what's everyone's nationalistic to some degree or another. It's just the degree to which they are. So it's such an easy emotional pull.
If I would add one thing, I think if I would add one thing to your question, it goes back to everybody wants to win. That's why it's complicated. That's why there's doping. That's why there's corruption. That's why it's complicated. Everybody wants to win. Your point that third world countries say, well, we may not be the best, we may not be the second best, but we're in it. And I think that that's part of the reason that there is all those things, those complicated things we talked about.
I do think it's interesting when you look at the opening ceremony, say, and all of the athletes are there, or most of them, and most of them aren't going to win, though, and I started following on Twitter during the Olympics this Indian female sprinter who had qualified for the Olympics, and just what she was posting about the Olympic experience and traveling in economy from India all the way to Rio, and her just, she knew she wasn't going to make the final or get out of her first heat, but there really was a value, it seemed like, to her to be an Olympian. But then at the higher levels, the stuff that you see on NBC, it is about winning. And so that drives that sort of thing. But like, I have a sling box, so I was actually able to watch the NBC coverage from Brazil a little bit, which is actually kind of interesting to see how what I'm seeing in Brazil is being interpreted by NBC's coverage, which is very US centric. And it really seemed like this was the return of the Cold War in the swimming pool between Millie King and the Russian swimmer. And stare downs in the green room or whatever it was. And I am curious to see where that goes now that Russia is maybe not what it was as a nation during the Cold War, but is sort of has regained this villain status in the United States in sports terms and seems pretty eager to play that role as well.
Which makes the World Cup in 2018.
I'd love to see Russia and the U.S. draw each other in the same group. I think that would be fantastic. And Russia, which has actually been a horrible soccer team for the last several years, and what will they do? Like yesterday in my discussion, they're naturalizing foreign-born players as Russians to represent them in 2018 because they're like, we cannot be horrible at this World Cup. But they got a long list to go.
That's a very good point to end on. I'd like to move to the audience for questions, because I know there's been a lot we have not touched on. Yes, Ed.
So thanks for this really fascinating panel and also profoundly depressing as a sports fan. It's like I just turn off my TV, never watch, never read anybody anymore, never go to a game anymore. And so, be it the waste, the overruns and the cost, for economic, downfall, the terrible consequences in terms of politics, human rights abuses, people dying on those construction sites, be it in Qatar or everywhere. So I would, sexism in sport. I was wondering, do you still see a role for these big sports events having a positive role in, be it economic development or social progress engine in various countries, mostly developing countries? What maybe Grant just finished with the Olympian, that Indian, that Olympian spirit still exists? Or do you see that sports can have a positive impact at a much smaller level? I mean, with a lot of the stories we read about NGOs and smaller local efforts in various countries, be it working on education, on economic development. I mean, are those big events just completely negative?
I would just say quickly that I've yet to see too many examples showing that there's real economic benefits going anywhere as a result of hosting Olympics or World Cups. I do think in terms of gender that increasing the ability of women in a lot of countries around the world where they don't even have the opportunities, this includes Brazil in many ways, to get involved deeply in sports, that can have a positive impact. It has, and that's one thing. There's a talk afterward, you look at the success of the US women athletes at the Olympics, that says a lot about opportunities in the United States. And that goes back to Title IX and several other things. But I think the more other countries can have their own types of Title IX, that is it's hard to argue against that as a positive.
I will tag right on to what Grant said. You do see some sort of tangible result at the level of greater investment in women's sports opportunities, particularly with FIFA and the increase of resources for women's teams, but also through other sports federations as well. I think one of the more recent examples we've seen was the effort by Great Britain to invest in their entire sports system ahead of hosting the London 2012 Games, providing funding support, which is of a very different sort of system than the US system is, but really ensuring that there is enough funding, support, attention devoted to a wide variety of sports federations and disciplines and athletes so that they had every opportunity try to do their best and to win and represent on home field advantage. You still see those after effects, certainly at the past Rio Games, when Britain had a very nice medal haul in many different sports, but I think cycling was one of the larger ones for them as well.
Those upticks often fall off, though, in subsequent cycles. So a lot of these countries that will fund when they're going to host the Olympics, boost women's participation, et cetera, they'll go down to almost zero after the fact. So I'm skeptical whether those have long-term or even medium-term benefits. But.
And real quick word on Brazil and Rio. I know we've talked a lot about the downside, but sports investment in judo, for example, a sport that's gotten big, not that big here, but is lifted in the favelas. They did do a very nice job of developing judo athletes, and one of them, I'm forgetting her name, but she won the first gold medal for Brazil at the Olympics, and she resides in a Rio favela. So there's definitely some good stories there.
The tricky part, though, is that it's so much money. I mean, what did Brazil spend? Like $13 billion or something?
On the whole thing.
Yeah, so, you know, there's obviously going to be positive stories and positives that come out of spending $13 billion, but it's just an unbelievable investment. I mean, when you start looking at comparing it to other, you know, you can look at like serious numbers in the federal budget, you know, health budgets for countries, or, you know, I think Russia was spending, you know, more than they spent on healthcare. It's something close like that. I mean, it's a remarkable, it tends to be a remarkable amount of money.
Yeah, just one quick question for the panel. Do you guys think things will change for the IOC or FIFA? They seem to be accountable to no one on the one hand, and you know, as a fan, like a lot of fans, as outrageous as these scandals are, you know, people are still going to watch. It's not going to change their behavior one way or another. So what's the catalyst out there for real reform in the way that these bodies operate, or is there one?
I mean, I'll start with FIFA. The Swiss government has been, over the years, horrible with holding any accountability for any of these bodies that are based there. There's a reason why they're all based there. So many of them are, the IOC, FIFA. Only recently has the Swiss government started to actually do something. There is a Swiss governmental investigation into FIFA right now, into Sepp Blatter and things that happened where they had raids on the FIFA headquarters to get documents. The Swiss government is working with the US government on the US governmental investigation into FIFA. I really do believe that it took the power of the US Department of Justice to finally do something that made FIFA scared of the people who run it. Because I can't think of any other body that would or could. And so finally you're starting to see some changes at FIFA, but then the question is, are there enough so far? And I don't know the answer to that yet. I'm skeptical. And I know FIFA's reputation is so bad, it's probably even worse than the IOC, I would think. Not that the IOC is great, but I mean, like, I think FIFA has such a negative reputation at this point that you need to see real results, real change. One thing that's interesting to me now is how much of a US influence there is at FIFA in the wake of the FIFA arrests, because you had the US government engineering the arrests, you have US law firms that now represent FIFA as it's tried to clean itself up, or says it's cleaning itself up. And then you've got US PR firms being hired by FIFA. There's almost starting to be a backlash inside FIFA, which is basically like the NCA. It's made up of its members, nations around the world. It's like the UN. And so a lot of these other countries now think the US has way too much influence inside FIFA, which may actually cost the U.S., we'll see, hosting World Cup 2026, which is sort of the holy grail for the U.S. Soccer Federation. They want to host the World Cup again. So it is very much like the UN, but I think they've got a long ways to go to show that they've actually reformed, and they're not close to being there yet.
I don't know. I mean, there's no sort of third party, watchdog, so to speak. So the only entity that would push the IOC to reform, I mean, there is no entity. The only thing that would push them to reform, besides just their desire to reform, would be if it was having an effect on the games. And again, I get back to one of the sort of points of the story we did, which is that there's no shortage of authoritarian governments in the world that and they're all dying to host these things. So all that said, the IOC does have something called Agenda 2020, which supposedly addresses a lot of these matters. But right after they passed Agenda 2020, the first decision they made was to award the Winter Games to Beijing. So
I would like to toss out food for thought with regards to your question. To what extent would an actual threatened and implemented boycott of an Olympic Games or a World Cup do to try to send a message? We've seen that that hasn't really worked before. Moscow 1980, LA 84, and those were boycotts more against regimes and not against the governing entities themselves. One wonders if taken under somewhat different circumstances and organized specifically to protest corruptness or the organization and try with the petition to try to force change, would that have any sort of impact at all? But you would certainly need agreement among many key participants to all go forward with such an action to make it even worthwhile.
I mean, what would you be boycotting and for what, and who would do it?
It would have to get a lot of buy-in and be well thought out, but with enough actors who would really hope to push for change.
Well,
I'm not saying that that is necessarily.
Yeah, I mean, the question is, what's the constituency that would push for that? So you have.
You can't have a World Cup if you don't have Germany, Italy, France, Brazil, Argentina show up.
Right.
Well, you can, but
I mean, those countries, I mean, some of those countries may be upset that they didn't, so Great Britain bid for, was it 2018? And they were, upset that they didn't win that, or did they bid for 2022? I can't remember, but 2018. But, the British Football Association makes a lot of money from the World Cup, so they're not incentivized to, the athletes in the case of soccer make good money from it. The Olympic athletes less so. But so I don't know who the constituency would be to push something like that.
The only thing I can think of would be if they had kept the Qatar World Cup in June and July, that you might have had players say, I'm not playing at 120 degrees. I'm not going to go. And it's probably that they would protest more against that than against 3,000 people died in the production of infrastructure for this World Cup. I have a hard time, I don't know, it seems bad to say this, I have a hard time imagining a current top soccer player boycotting a World Cup for human rights reasons. I mean,
I do as well, but
it's not a great commentary on the current state of things. Now, Johan Cruyff skipped the '78 World Cup in Argentina in part because of the regime, but there aren't too many Johan Cruyffs these days.
There was a lot of talk of that before the Sochi Olympics, would there be boycotts? And I don't think we saw any boycotts.
Yeah, there was. I think, doesn't the IOC have like a rule where you're not allowed to actively protest during the games?
Right.
didn't they throw Carlos and the guys who did the salute out of the?
Yeah.
They threw them out of the village, right?
Yeah,
After
the Mexico City.
Yeah,
Yeah,
so, I mean, you know.
Yeah.
We have a question in the back.
Yes, so first off, thank you to the panel for all your insights to everything we covered here. So I'm curious about what your thoughts are. I know you mentioned that there's a narrowing of sort of the host cities that are, offering to host the games. And yet, we were seeing NBC pay continuously for the broadcast rights, these record amounts, the IOCs. You saw them pay record amounts in Beijing and London and even now in Rio. And my thought is, what's the benefit to the TV? I know Grant mentioned that he saw the coverage there and it was mostly US centric. If you look at what the revenue is, the revenue has been dropping for NBC continuously with every successive games. So what is the benefit to NBC to continue to fight these US TV rights if it seems that the interest in the games is certainly, maybe not as much as it used to be, like you said, in the pre-Cold War years?
The numbers are still huge.
Yeah, I just saw a quick headline today that NBC made $200 million on the Rio Olympics. So,
And I think, it'll probably be among the most watched shows this year. I mean, I haven't looked closely at this year's numbers, and I know they were down, but typically the Olympic numbers are enormous. As TV viewership becomes smaller and is far more segmented to different places, there's very few sort of there's not a lot of appointment viewing anymore in America. You have football games on Sunday, the debates, in the Olympics. And so, and as I understand it, I don't know a lot about this, but there's certain things that you just need to advertise on TV. They're like emotional buys, cars, and that type of thing. And so those entities will pay premiums to be able to reach people on television, which is harder and harder to do. And so
this is a bit of a future of media thing, but as streaming becomes bigger and people all move off TVs more and more for the NBCs of the world paying rights, how do you monetize? Can you monetize, online the same way? And every media organization is fighting with that as well.